seafood, what this has meant through your work, both as you came up as a chef and a restaurateur, as well as ultimately your position on the board at Hog Island and the work that you've done with Seafood Watch. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. My pleasure.
And so, and look at how much the world has changed since we started to first talk about sustainable seafood.
It has, I think you know this story, but it relates specifically to Norwegian salmon. And I remember in the late 70s, in my restaurant days, they started selling Norwegian salmon in America. And we were all so enchanted by it because, of course, never having been to Norway, what do I know? The vision was the icy cold fjords, the fish out there swimming around, and then they get delivered overnight to us. How much better could it be? And then I had a chance for an ill-fated PBS series to go visit Norway. It was called Food Treasures of the World. And I went out to visit some of the salmon farms then. And at that time, it wasn't such a pretty picture because they were overcrowding the farms, the pens. They were using lots of antibiotics and other kinds of things. And it really kind of soured me on the whole thing. Clearly, however, times have changed. And it wasn't that these were evil people. It was that just starting, this was the way they learned too how to do it. And it was also part of the thing that happened was I remember Marion Burroughs at the New York Times did a whole big series on don't eat farm salmon because of all kinds of things, and many of them legitimate. But again, I think salmon farmers recognized the challenge and things changed. And the fascinating thing is, and I can put my other hat on as being part of Seafood Watch for all of these years, the Monterey Bay Aquarium's thing that they do that helps you buy responsibly fish and shellfish of all kinds. They, in those early years, would have nothing to do with farm salmon at all. But even they have recognized that farm salmon can be done in a sustainable and wholesome way. And in fact, a couple of farm salmon people are now on the green list, which is an important thing. So times have changed. And I think without blabbing on too much about this, one of the things that the aquarium pointed out was that the future of seafood is farming, is aquaculture. Mm-hmm. The seas are tapped out. We really can't pull any more from the seas. And it's something like now, and you may know this better than I, but it's something now like more than 50% of the finned and shellfish that we eat comes from farm-raised sources. And looking forward, it's going to be even more. So finding those good sources, people who are doing it responsibly, is the challenge for us all.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like it's really a new food system. You talked about this, having visited at the farm at such an early stage.
Yeah.
It has to have parallels to what you saw in land-based agriculture and in land-based rearing of protein.
Oh, absolutely. We've learned, I mean, that's a really good point. We've learned on the land-based side of proteins, all of the awful things that were being done that, of course, none of us knew about. And I think part of it is that both with cattle and pigs and chickens and all of that stuff, as well as seafood, most of us have been so divorced from information about it. But thank God for the net. Now we can get information. And I think on both sides, both on the land and in the sea, many people, not all, but many people are doing a much better job.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. And what we learned in those early parts of the food system, I mean, you really were the one who brought to the forefront with just a few others, this from the earth to the table, farm to plate movement. And what was happening with fish and seafood at that point? Was it mainly wild that was available, particularly since you were in Northern California and there is an abundance of the sea? And what were you asking? What kinds of questions were you asking then versus what you know now?
Well, the interesting thing about it is that, I mean, people tend to think that Northern California, we have everything all the time. And of course we don't. And especially as it affects seafood, there are some things that we're blessed to have: salmon in season, Dungeness crab, those kinds of things. But actually there are other parts of the United States which have many more species, many more things to choose from than we do here. So one of the things that began to happen, which had its good aspects and its bad aspects, was stuff began to be shipped from everywhere so that I could get back in those days, fresh fish from Hawaii overnight, fresh fish from the Gulf Coast, from the Northeast, from Canada, all of that stuff. But then there were issues that came up about how sustainable is that when you think about the cost of shipping, the use of packing materials, the disposal of packing materials, all of that. So I think all of our consciousness were raised, and for a time it was just serve what's available to you locally. Forget about trying to get all this other stuff.
Mm-hmm. And so with that, as time evolved, I mean, you make this trip to Norway, and then how did you feel like things changed enough for you to go and visit a sustainable salmon farm like you did, 7 or 8 years ago?
Yeah, well, in part it was and part of it was because you've been involved in this for such a long time that you helped me to sort of see that there were ethical salmon farmers, farm-raised salmon farmers out there that were doing a good job. And so it was then that we began to see, and again, my role with the Monterey Bay Aquarium and others, Chefs Collaborative was another big one, was that no, there are some ethically raised, farm-raised fishes and shellfishes out there. And so let's find out about them. And what does that mean when you say ethically raised?
Mm-hmm. And I think that's the interesting thing. What does that mean? Because now let's talk about the history of that, because Seafood Watch, we know, was at the forefront, but it has evolved. I mean, there are several certification schemes, and I think it's somewhat confusing for chefs now.
Well, it is for chefs, and I think even more for consumers.
Yes.
Because there are lots of good resources. MSC is one of those that does a lot of good work. Other aquariums, like the Vancouver Aquarium, does their own kind of investigations and all of that. But it's kind of like one of the things that we're hearing today in other areas, especially in politics, is that the importance of science-based evaluations of kind of what's going on out there. And like land-based protein sources, we've learned a lot in the last few years about what to do, what to avoid, how to find third-party certification for these things, which is terribly important. So I think the challenge for chefs is to seek out that third-party certification. And there are many of those. The gold standard still, I think, is Seafood Watch at Monterey Bay Aquarium.
Mm-hmm. And that, as you had said, the brilliance of what they've been able to do through your voice and others is to evolve so that it has become more inclusive. They are working together more and working with the other aquariums. And a lot of the science is based from what Seafood Watch's team does.
Yes, they've helped a lot. The issue is to make sure that chefs and consumers are getting the straight goods. There are fish markets that I go into who say, well, we don't use any of those evaluation guides. We have our own. And so this is, we're telling you this is sustainably, ethically raised fish. And and sometimes there's no backdrop for that. So I think that as it is for organic, generally for land-based products, that third-party certification is terribly important.
Mhm. And there are farmers that are even ahead now, I think, of those certification schemes where their
Yeah.
practices are even that much better. So, from your perspective, is that just a starting point?
Well, it's a good starting point, and it's something that if you can't do anything else, if you don't have the time to dig much deeper into it, the fact that all of this good work is going on and is being published, both on the net and other places, if you don't go any further, that's a good place to go. But you're absolutely right. One of the organizations I mentioned it earlier that I was involved with for a number of years, actually helped found that one too, was Chefs Collaborative.
Right.
And they have really pushed beyond that and pushed into areas that even Monterey Bay Aquarium hasn't. And their focus now is primarily on locally raised products to really get to know the fishermen,
Hmm.
the, the people who are doing the work.
Hmm. And then you also have the work that you've done with UMass and how this has come out from a sustainable and a health perspective. Tell us about that program.
Well, yeah, for a number of years I've participated in this. It goes by different titles each year, but it is a gathering of all of the chefs and providers for college and university feeding programs. And it happens in June when school closes.
Mhm.
And they get each year more than 200, 300 colleges and universities who come to learn the latest, to hear lectures by all kinds of people. And I've talked a couple of times about farm raised fish because there was still, because of that uh, the initial problems with, back in the 70s and 80s with what was going on, there still is a belief that farm raised, especially fin fish, are in
Mhm.
trouble. But as I like pointing out to everybody, we've been eating farm raised fish and shellfish for a long time without any problems. Oysters, mussels, clams, catfish, tilapia, uh, even salmonoid uh, fishes like Arctic char and all of that stuff, who have passed muster. But for some reason, salmon got because it's the most popular fish, I guess, after canned tuna and shrimp. Uh,
Right.
and shrimp suffered from the same thing too. It was that because we were getting a lot of shrimp coming from other parts of the world that were not raised ethically at all. A lot of chemistry was being used, a lot of techniques which were not healthful were happening too. So there's kind of a parallel between shrimp and salmon there. But it's fascinating now that there are great sources for both wild caught and farm raised shrimp, as there are for wild caught and farm raised salmon.
And isn't that really what we should be doing, especially as you look on menu listings, that it should be a balance of wild and farmed. And what we would like to
Yeah.
see is more fish and seafood offered on menu, which still, unless you're in a restaurant that is predominantly or known as a fish house, it still doesn't have an equal place on the menu.
Well, and the problem as a chef, as a restaurateur, talking about it, when you think about wild caught, especially wild caught salmon, it's so expensive.
Right.
And partly because it's been exploited. I mean, there's still a reasonable supply. As you know, I've worked for years with Alaska seafood marketing with wild salmon. But because of habitat destruction, sometimes overfishing, all of that kind of stuff, there's just not as much of it available. And if you had to rely upon wild salmon only, number one, you couldn't serve it all year round. And number two, it's so expensive that most restaurants can't afford to buy it.
Mhm. So what do you think the future looks like? Because now we see that we're trying, we know we manage our wild fisheries in the US well. We want to be able to start to expand aquaculture. What does the future look like on menu and in the grocery stores where we see people are buying more fish and seafood during this crisis? as they're cooking at home.
Yeah. Well, I think it's not going to slow down. You know, I think the work that Harvard and other people have done says that you need to eat more seafood, and in fact, eat much less of the land animals, partly because of the way many of them are raised, but also because of the impact on the environment with the way that land-based protein sources are raised and all of that stuff. But the future really is seafood. So, and I think that message finally is getting through, that eat as much as you can, that all of I mean, there's lots and lots of good studies, but I recommend that people go to the Harvard School of Public Health, and they have a great library of reasons why you want to eat this. And they've come around too to the idea that ethically raised, and I want to emphasize that word, ethically raised seafood, farm seafood is the future, again, because the seas are tapped out.
That's exactly right. And what about for chefs? As we wrap up our time together, do you think there's still a debate, farmed versus wild, or is that starting to ease since you and I were getting all of our gray hairs having those arguments years ago?
Well, yes, there still is a debate between them. And it seems now to be breaking down as the debate with older chefs versus younger chefs. And I think younger chefs, especially those who've gone to culinary school, as you know, I have taught for years at the CIA. The culinary schools have finally gotten, for a long time they didn't take a position, have finally gotten on the bandwagon to talk about the importance of farm-raised fish. And that, again, if you know its source and know the people who are raising it, it is as good as anything that is wild caught. But I think there are a lot of old timers who, you know, got indoctrinated with those, with that early information that we got, and they're not going to change.
And this is such a unique opportunity to change our food system, be educated, help work with these farmers and these large companies. And I know we've talked about Quarry Arctic and how rare it is to have a third generation family farmer doing this work on the water. So it's such an incredible, I think, opportunity for all of us.
Yes, and you know, as much as I know about them, they also have gone through those stages. They've learned by doing, they've taken advantage of the information that's out there, as have some other farm-raised salmon producers too. So there are choices.
There are choices. So look, use your Seafood Watch app. Yeah. And John, thank you for being one of those early adopters. It certainly has been great to be swimming in these waters with you.
Oh, thanks.
and thank you. And thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Okay, take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.